The ring came off in silence. 60 people watched Dominic Ashcroft slide the platinum band from his wife's finger at the head of the dining table on Christmas Eve. The chandelier above cast soft gold across the bone china and crystal stemware, across the faces of aunts and uncles and cousins who had spent the evening pretending Sophia Beaumont didn't exist until this moment demanded they acknowledge her departure. Dominic's fingers were careful, almost tender, as if removing the ring slowly might soften what he was doing. It didn't. The metal left a pale groove in Sophia's skin where 6 years of marriage had lived, a white band the sun had never touched because she had never taken the ring off. Not once, not even to sleep. Sophia sat perfectly still. Her hands rested on the tablecloth, one palm covering the other, both pressed flat against her thighs beneath the table's edge, where no one could see them shake. She was 6 months pregnant. The swell of her belly pushed against the deep burgundy dress she had chosen that morning when the house still felt like it might be hers, when the day still held the possibility of something other than this. Her skin was the warm brown her mother Lenora used to call Georgia clay, beautiful and strong, the kind of complexion that held light differently than the pale faces surrounding her now. She had learned to sit in rooms like this without flinching, to let the scrutiny wash over her like cold water until her body forgot to react. Dominic turned to the woman standing in the doorway to the kitchen. Claire Hastings stepped forward in a dress the color of winter moss, expensive fabric that moved like water as she crossed the Persian rug. She had been at 3 Ashcroft family gatherings before tonight, introduced each time as a consultant helping with estate planning and corporate restructuring. She smiled at Sophia once, 6 months ago, a smile that contained no warmth and no apology, just the clinical assessment of someone measuring a space they planned to occupy. Tonight she wore that same smile as she approached the table and stood beside Dominic's chair. He slipped the ring onto Claire's finger without looking at Sophia. The band fit without adjustment, no tightness, no gap, as if the ring had always been meant for Claire's hand. And Sophia had simply been keeping it warm. That detail, that perfect fit, cut deeper than anything else. It meant someone had planned this. Someone had measured. Someone had made certain that when this moment arrived, it would arrive without friction, without the messy resistance of a ring that didn't quite belong. Vivian Ashcroft rose from her seat at the far end of the table. She was 65, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in cream silk that probably cost more than Sophia's entire wardrobe. She had the kind of beauty that came from money and maintenance, from weekly appointments and procedures Sophia couldn't name. She moved with the certainty of a woman who had never been told no, who had spent her entire life in rooms that rearranged themselves to accommodate her presence. She walked the length of the table and stopped beside Sophia's chair. The older woman's hand settled on Sophia's shoulder, light as a bird, warm through the fabric of the dress. She leaned down until her mouth was close to Sophia's ear, close enough that her voice didn't need to carry beyond the two of them. "I think we all knew this was coming, dear. Don't make it harder than it has to be." Sophia felt the words land like stones in her chest. She turned her head, met Vivian's eyes, saw nothing there but the polite concern a person might show a stranger who had stumbled on the sidewalk. No guilt, no recognition of the 6 years Sophia had spent in this house, cooking meals for this family, organizing fundraisers and charity events and Christmas dinners exactly like this one. She had been working since 4 o'clock that morning, preparing the honey-glazed ham and the sweet potato casserole and the 3 kinds of pie that now sat half-eaten on the sideboard. Her feet ached, her back ached. The baby had been kicking all evening, restless, as if sensing something wrong in the air around them. Vivian lifted Sophia's plate from in front of her, the porcelain still holding the remnants of food Sophia hadn't been able to eat. The gesture was gentle, efficient, the way you might clear a table after a guest has finished their meal and is preparing to leave. It told everyone watching that this was over. that Sophia's place at this table had been a temporary arrangement that had reached its natural conclusion. Sophia stood. The chair legs scraped against hardwood and someone at the far end of the table coughed into their napkin to cover the sound. She looked around the room at 60 faces, aunts who had asked her to volunteer at church functions, uncles who had shaken her hand at weddings and baptisms, cousins who had smiled at her across Thanksgiving tables and 4th of July barbecues. Not one of them met her eyes now. They looked at their plates, their wine glasses, the flicker of candles in their hurricane lamps. They had all known. They had sat down to this meal knowing what would happen before dessert, and they had eaten her food anyway. She turned to Vivian, and the words came out before she could think them through. "You should have waited, Mrs. Ashcroft. You really should have waited." The older woman's face shifted, a small crease appearing between her eyebrows, confusion or perhaps annoyance at being addressed directly. She waved one hand in a gesture of dismissal, already turning back toward her seat. "Dramatic as always." Sophia walked toward the front door. She didn't reach for her coat on the rack beside the entrance. She didn't grab her shoes from the mat where she had left them when she arrived that morning, the comfortable flats she wore when she knew she would be standing in the kitchen for hours. She just opened the door and stepped out into the night. The cold hit her like a physical blow. December in Boston carried a particular kind of bite, the air sharp enough to steal breath. Especially at 11 o'clock when the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees, the stone pathway from the front door to the driveway was covered in a thin layer of ice that cracked under her bare feet. She stopped on the front steps, one hand instinctively moving to rest on her belly, feeling the baby shift and settle inside her. Behind her, the door closed, not slammed, just pulled shut with a soft click that sounded quieter than everything that had happened inside. Through the tall windows that flanked the entrance, she could see shadows moving. People returning to their conversations, reaching for dessert, the party resuming as if she had never been there at all. Someone turned up the volume on the Christmas music. Bing Crosby's voice drifted out into the night, smooth and warm, singing about white Christmas and dreams that never came true in the way you imagined them. Sophia stood on the steps and tried to remember how to breathe. The air hurt going in, burned in her lungs, but she pulled it in anyway because the alternative was standing here until her body gave up and she collapsed. She could feel her toes going numb against the frozen stone. Her dress was sleeveless, meant for indoor warmth, and the wind cut through the thin fabric like it wasn't there. Her phone buzzed in the small clutch purse she had somehow managed to keep in her hand. Through everything. The screen glowed in the darkness, a single word appearing in bright letters. Father. She stared at that word for a long moment, 7 years. It had been 7 years since she had seen Charles Beaumont in person, since the day he had sat across from her in a coffee shop in Boston and told her he was leaving. "Not forever," he said. "Just for a while. Just long enough to build something that would matter." He had asked her to trust him, to live her life as if he wasn't watching, as if he had truly disappeared the way everyone in her neighborhood assumed when a man walked out and didn't come back. He promised he would know when she needed him. She answered the call. "Daddy." The voice on the other end was exactly as she remembered it, low and steady, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. "Baby girl, are you safe? I'm standing outside. It's 15 degrees. I don't have shoes." A pause, then. "The closing is January 26th. Can you hold on until then?" "I've been holding on for 7 years. I can hold on another month." "Good girl. Maxwell is sending a car. 5 minutes. Don't go back inside." The line went silent. Sophia lowered the phone and looked back at the house, at the warm light spilling from every window, at the shapes of people moving inside like figures in a snow globe. She thought about the first time Dominic had brought her here, 3 months after they started dating. He had been nervous, running his hand through his hair the way he always did when he was worried about something. He told her his mother could be difficult, that she had very specific ideas about who belonged in the Ashcroft family and who didn't. But he loved Sophia, he said, and that was all that mattered. For a while she had believed him. She heard the crunch of tires on gravel and turned to see headlights approaching up the long driveway. A black sedan pulled to a stop in front of the house, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, moving quickly to open the rear passenger door. He didn't ask questions, didn't comment on her bare feet or the fact that she was visibly pregnant and shivering in a sleeveless dress. He simply gestured to the open door and waited. Sophia walked down the steps, her feet leaving small wet prints on the ice-covered stone. She slid into the back seat and the driver closed the door behind her, sealing her into warmth and silence. The car pulled away from the house, gravel crunching under the tires, and Sophia watched through the rear window as the lights grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely behind the bare winter trees. The driver spoke without turning around. "There's a blanket on the seat beside you, Ms. Beaumont, and your father asked me to give you this." He passed back a small envelope, cream-colored paper, expensive weight. Sophia recognized her father's handwriting on the front, just her name in dark ink. She opened it carefully and pulled out a single card. The message was brief. "They failed the test. Now we protect what matters. I love you." She pressed the card against her chest and closed her eyes, feeling the baby kick once, twice, a reminder that she wasn't alone even when she felt most invisible. The car turned onto the main road and accelerated, carrying her away from the only home she had known for 6 years, toward whatever came next. To understand how Sophia Beaumont ended up barefoot in the snow on Christmas Eve, you have to go back 7 years to a morning in Boston when she was 30 years old and working the opening shift at a cafe in Cambridge. She had been living in the city for 3 years by then, sharing a studio apartment with a nursing student who worked nights and slept days, their lives passing each other in the doorway like ships that never quite met. Sophia took classes online when she could afford them, studying marketing and business administration through a community college program that let her work at her own pace. She was good at it, good at understanding what people wanted and how to show them they needed it. But the degree felt distant, something that belonged to a future version of herself she couldn't quite imagine yet. Her mother, Lenora, had died 2 years earlier, a stroke that came without warning and took her in less than an hour. She had been a night nurse at Mass General for 23 years, the kind of nurse who remembered patient names and brought homemade soup to families sitting vigil in waiting rooms. She never made much money, but she made sure Sophia never went without the things that mattered: books and school supplies and a warm coat every winter. She taught her daughter that worth had nothing to do with the balance in your bank account or the color of your skin, that the only measure that counted was how you treated people who could do nothing for you in return. Sophia's father had left when she was 8. That was the story Lenora told, the story everyone in their neighborhood knew and accepted, because men leaving was common enough not to require explanation. Charles Beaumont had worked construction, then janitorial services, jobs that kept him out of the house more than in it. One day he was there, the next he wasn't, and Lenora never spoke about him except to say he had his reasons, and they should respect them. What Sophia didn't know, what Lenora had promised never to tell her, was that Charles hadn't left because he was running from responsibility. He had left because he saw something in the world that terrified him. The way people looked at his daughter when they walked through certain neighborhoods. The way teachers lowered their expectations before Sophia even opened her mouth. The way doors closed softly but firmly when her name appeared on applications. He couldn't change the world, but he could build something large enough to protect her from it, and that required time and slants, and a kind of patience most people couldn't understand. The morning Dominic Ashcroft walked into the cafe where Sophia worked, she was wiping down tables and thinking about the essay she needed to finish for her Introduction to Consumer Behavior class. The cafe was nearly empty, the early crowd already gone, the lunch rush still an hour away. Dominic ordered a black coffee and a blueberry muffin and left a $20 bill in the tip jar, far more than the drink and pastry cost. When Sophia brought his order to the table, he looked up from his laptop and smiled at her, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. He came back the next day, and the day after that. On the fourth day, he wrote his number on the side of his coffee cup and told her he just liked talking about books with someone who actually read them. They went to dinner that weekend, a small Italian place in the North End where the pasta was handmade and the tables were so close together you could hear your neighbors' conversations. Dominic talked about his work at a corporate law firm, the long hours and the demanding partners, but also about the satisfaction of solving complex problems, of finding solutions in the spaces between regulations and precedents. He asked about her classes, about what she wanted to do when she finished her degree, and he listened to her answers like they mattered. For the first year, everything felt possible. They moved into a studio apartment together in Cambridge, a cramped space with barely enough room for a bed and a desk, but it was theirs. Dominic would read the newspaper aloud on Sunday mornings while Sophia made coffee, his voice turning the dry financial news into something almost poetic. He left notes in the pockets of her jacket, small scraps of paper with messages like, "Thinking about you," or "You make everything make sense." She kept every single one, stored in a small wooden box on the dresser they shared. They married at City Hall 18 months after they met, just the two of them and a witness Dominic pulled from the hallway outside the clerk's office. Margot, Dominic's younger sister, flew in from New York where she was finishing her residency in pediatric medicine. She hugged Sophia after the ceremony and whispered that she had never seen her brother this happy, that whatever Sophia was doing, she should keep doing it. For the first 2 years of marriage, Dominic still left notes. He still defended Sophia when his mother made one of her careful, cutting remarks about simple tastes and modest backgrounds. But something shifted in year 3, subtle at first, like a foundation settling in ways you couldn't see but could feel in how doors stopped closing quite right. Vivian Ashcroft had never approved of her son's choice. She came from old Boston money, the kind that built libraries and funded museum wings and appeared in the society pages of newspapers that still mattered to people who cared about such things. She had expected Dominic to marry someone from that world, a young woman with the right last name and the right education and the right complexion. When he brought Sophia home for the first time, Vivian's smile had been perfect and cold, the kind of expression you might show a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the room, but you were too polite to comment on directly. She never said anything explicitly cruel. That wasn't Vivian's style. Instead, she asked questions that sounded like concern, but carried sharper edges underneath. "Are you sure she'll fit in with our circle, darling?" Or, "I just worry she won't understand our family's complexities." She praised Sophia's cooking while suggesting it was probably the best she could manage given her background. She complimented Sophia's dress while mentioning it looked like something you might find at a discount store, which was meant as solidarity, she insisted, because it was smart to shop within your means. Dominic had pushed back once, early on. Sophia overheard him in the study at the Ashcroft estate, his voice low but firm, telling his mother that Sophia was his wife and Vivian needed to treat her with respect. Vivian's response was too quiet to hear, but whatever she said made Dominic fall silent. After that night, he stopped defending Sophia. Not suddenly, not in a way you could point to and say that was the moment everything changed. He just stopped meeting her eyes when Vivian made her careful comments. He found excuses to be elsewhere when family conversations turned toward topics that made Sophia feel like an outsider in her own marriage. By year 4, the notes stopped appearing in Sophia's jacket pockets. Dominic stayed late at the office more nights than not, citing cases that needed attention, partners who demanded FaceTime. He bought a new suit without telling her, expensive Italian wool that Vivian noticed immediately and praised extensively. He started attending social events without Sophia, explaining that she would be bored, that these were work functions where she wouldn't know anyone, that it was easier if he just went alone. In year 5, Claire Hastings appeared. She was introduced as a consultant working with the Ashcroft family on property management and corporate restructuring, someone Vivian had found through her network of connections that spanned the better Boston families. Claire was polished in a way Sophia had never managed. Her hair always perfectly styled, her clothes expensive but understated, her conversation peppered with references to people and places that signaled belonging. She joined family dinners and charity events, always seated near Dominic, always engaged in intense discussions about legal strategies and investment opportunities. Sophia noticed the way Dominic's posture changed when Claire entered a room, the way he sat up straighter and smiled more readily. She noticed the text messages that came late at night, the phone calls he took in another room with the door closed. She noticed the scent of perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his collar, something expensive and floral that made her stomach turn. She didn't confront him. Part of her knew that confrontation would only accelerate whatever was already in motion. Part of her was too tired to fight, too worn down by 6 years of trying to belong in a family that had never wanted her there. And part of her, the part that remembered her mother's teachings about dignity and patience, knew that the truth would reveal itself without her having to demand it. In June of their 6th year of marriage, Dominic stayed out until 3 in the morning. He came home smelling like wine and someone else's perfume, and when Sophia asked where he had been, he told her it was none of her business, his voice flat and cold in a way she had never heard before. She knew then that whatever they had built together in that studio apartment in Cambridge had been demolished, room by room, until only the foundation remained, and even that was cracked beyond repair. 2 months later, in August, Sophia realized she was pregnant. She took 3 different tests to be certain, sitting on the bathroom floor of the house that had never felt like hers, watching the lines appear and trying to decide what she felt. Fear, certainly. Worry about bringing a child into a marriage that was already dying, but also something else, something fierce and protective, a certainty that this baby deserved better than what Sophia had accepted for herself. She told Dominic that evening when he came home from work. He set down his briefcase and stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he asked, "Are you sure it's the right time? Not are you happy? Not this is wonderful. Just a question about timing, as if the baby were a business decision that could be rescheduled for a more convenient quarter." That night, Sophia received a call from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was male, professional, careful. "Ms. Beaumont, my name is Maxwell Reed. I'm calling on behalf of your father. He wanted me to ask if you're ready." She had sat in the dark living room, the phone pressed to her ear, and thought about the 7 years since she had last seen Charles face to face. "Not yet," she said finally. "He told me 7 years. I need to know if Dominic truly loves me or if he loves what he thought I could be." Maxwell had been silent for a moment, then replied, "I'll inform Mr. Beaumont. He'll be ready when you are." The months that followed were a slow erosion of everything Sophia had tried to build. Vivian's comments became sharper, less coded. At a charity luncheon in October, she introduced Sophia to a group of donors as "my son's wife, bless her heart, she tries so hard." The phrase hung in the air like smoke, the implication clear to everyone listening. At Thanksgiving dinner, Vivian seated Sophia at the far end of the table, near the children and the family members no one particularly wanted to talk to, while Claire sat beside Dominic in the place that should have been Sophia's. By November, Sophia was 6 months pregnant, her belly round and obvious under the loose dresses she wore. The baby kicked constantly, especially at night when Sophia lay awake listening to Dominic breathe beside her, the space between them in the bed wider than any physical distance could measure. She wondered if he could feel it, the way everything had changed, or if he had convinced himself that this was just the natural evolution of a marriage, that love was supposed to fade into convenience and convenience into tolerance. The Friday after Thanksgiving, Vivian called Sophia into her study at the estate. The room was all dark wood and leather, filled with books Sophia suspected no one had read in decades. Vivian sat behind her desk like a queen granting audience, her hands folded on the polished surface. She explained that the family would be hosting a very important Christmas dinner. 60 guests, all key figures in Boston's social and business circles. She needed Sophia to handle the cooking, all of it, because the caterer had canceled and Vivian simply didn't trust anyone else to understand the family's standards. It would mean arriving at 4 in the morning to start preparations, working through the entire day, but surely Sophia understood how important this was, how much was riding on everything being perfect. Sophia had nodded, agreed, watched Vivian's smile sharpen with satisfaction. She didn't mention the pregnancy, didn't point out that standing for 12 hours in her condition might not be wise. She just accepted the assignment and left the study, knowing even then what was coming, feeling it in her bones like a change in weather. December 24th arrived cold and clear. Sophia rose at 3:30 in the morning, dressed in the burgundy maternity dress she had bought specifically for this evening, hoping she might be allowed to join the dinner as a guest rather than serving it. She drove to the estate in the pre-dawn darkness, let herself in through the kitchen entrance, and began the work of preparing a meal for 60 people. By noon, the ham was glazing in the oven and the sweet potato casserole was assembled. By 3, the pies were cooling on the counter and the dining room table was set with Vivian's best china. By 5, when the first guests began to arrive, Sophia's back ached and her feet had swollen inside her shoes and the baby was kicking hard enough to make her wince. She moved through the house like a shadow, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates, invisible until someone needed something. No one thanked her. No one asked how she was feeling or commented on her pregnancy except to suggest she might want to sit down. She looked tired. Perhaps she should rest in the kitchen until she was needed again. At 7, Vivian made a toast welcoming everyone to the Ashcroft home, thanking them for sharing this special evening. She mentioned Dominic and Garrett and several cousins by name, praising their accomplishments and contributions to the family legacy. She did not mention Sophia. At 8, Sophia finally sat down at the table beside Dominic. Her plate was already filled, someone else's idea of appropriate portions. Dominic didn't look at her when she took her seat. He was deep in conversation with Claire, who sat across from him, looking radiant in her moss-green dress, laughing at something he said in a way that suggested intimacy, history, a future. That was when Dominic stood up and tapped his fork against his wine glass. The room fell silent. Sophia felt her heartbeat loud in her ears, felt the baby shift inside her as if sensing something wrong. Dominic thanked everyone for coming, for being part of this important evening. He talked about family and legacy and the hard choices that sometimes needed to be made for the greater good. His voice was steady, rehearsed, the tone he used when presenting to partners at the firm. Then he said it, not loudly, not with cruelty, but with the calm finality of someone who had already made peace with his decision. He and Sophia had been moving in different directions for some time now. It was better to acknowledge that truth than to continue pretending. He wished her well, hoped she would find what she needed, but this marriage had run its course. The door to the kitchen opened and Claire stepped through, moving across the room like she had done this before, like she had rehearsed her entrance the way Dominic had rehearsed his speech. She stood beside his chair and Sophia watched him reach for her hand. Watched him slide the ring off Sophia's finger with such careful tenderness, watched him place it on Claire's hand, where it fit perfectly because someone had made certain it would. Vivian's hand settled on Sophia's shoulder, warm and light and utterly without mercy. The older woman lifted Sophia's plate from the table and set it aside, the gesture gentle but absolute, a dismissal that required no words. Sophia stood because there was nothing else to do, because staying meant watching 60 people celebrate her erasure, and she had endured enough for one evening. for one marriage, for one lifetime of trying to make herself small enough to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold her. She looked at Vivian and spoke the only words that mattered. "You should have waited, Mrs. Ashcroft. You really should have waited." Then she walked out into the snow, into the cold, into the night that would change everything. The car Maxwell sent took her to a hotel near the harbor, a small boutique property where the front desk clerk checked her in without comment, offering only a room key and a quiet direction to the elevators. Sophia rode up to the third floor and let herself into a room that was warm and anonymous, decorated in shades of cream and gray that required nothing from her. She sat on the edge of the bed and felt the baby kick, steady and insistent, a reminder that she was not alone even when she felt most abandoned. Her phone buzzed again. Maxwell Reed this time, not her father. "Ms. Beaumont, I'm sending over some documents for you to review. Nothing urgent, just information you should have about what happens next. The closing is scheduled for January 26th at 9 in the morning. Your father wanted you to know that everything is ready. You just need to hold on a little longer." Sophia thanked him and ended the call. She pulled the blanket from the car over her shoulders and lay back against the pillows, her hand resting on her belly, feeling the baby settle and quiet. Outside the window, the city glowed with Christmas lights. Thousands of families gathered in warm houses, celebrating traditions and connections that felt impossibly distant from where she sat now. But somewhere in that city, her father was waiting. Somewhere in that city, people were preparing for a meeting that would change the shape of everything Vivian Ashcroft thought she controlled. And somewhere in Sophia's own body, a daughter was growing who would never know what it meant to be discarded, who would grow up understanding that her worth was absolute and unchanging regardless of what anyone else believed. Sophia closed her eyes and whispered into the quiet room, "Just a little longer. We can hold on just a little longer." The baby kicked once in response, and Sophia smiled despite everything, despite the cold and the humiliation and the ring-shaped groove still visible on her finger. Because she knew something Vivian Ashcroft didn't know, something Dominic would learn soon enough. Patience was the most expensive currency a person could own, and Sophia Beaumont had been saving hers for 7 years. The motel off Route 1 cost $55 a night and smelled like industrial cleaner and decades of transient lives. Sophia moved into room 212 on December 26th, carrying a single duffel bag containing the clothes she had grabbed from the house while Dominic was at work and Vivian was at her weekly bridge game. The room had thin carpeting worn smooth in pathways between the bed and the bathroom, a television bolted to the dresser, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot where semis idled through the night on their way to somewhere else. She woke on the second morning to find her phone disconnected from the family plan. No warning, no message, just a blank screen when she tried to check her email, followed by a notification that service had been terminated. She walked to the motel office and used their phone to call the cellular company, where a representative explained with practiced sympathy that the account holder had removed her line effective immediately. Would she like to start a new account? She would need a credit card and identification. Sophia hung up and walked back to her room, the January cold seeping through her coat. She tried logging into the joint bank account she shared with Dominic, the one where her paychecks from the part-time work she had done before the pregnancy had been deposited, the one that held 6 years of careful saving. The screen returned an error. Account access denied. She called the bank from the motel office phone and listened to an automated system explain that she had been removed as an authorized user. For further assistance, she could visit a branch location during business hours. That afternoon, she drove to the Ashcroft estate to collect the rest of her belongings. The security gate that had always opened automatically when her car approached stayed closed. She pressed the call button and waited, watching her breath cloud in the cold air. Garrett's voice crackled through the speaker, flat and bored. "This residence is private property. Please leave." She pressed the button again. "It's Sophia. I need to get my things." A pause, then Garrett's voice again, slightly amused. "Your things were packed and sent to storage. The family attorney will forward you the location. Don't come back here." The gate remained closed. Sophia sat in her car for 10 minutes. Engine running for warmth, staring at the house visible beyond the iron bars and winter-bare trees. Then she put the car in reverse and drove away, knowing she wouldn't return, that this door, like so many others, had closed with the soft finality of people who no longer needed to pretend courtesy. The erasure continued in systematic increments, each loss small enough to seem almost reasonable until they accumulated into something that resembled an intentional campaign to remove every trace of her existence. Her name disappeared from the family group chat, then was added back 3 days later when someone noticed and felt obligated to maintain appearances. The messages continued as before, discussions of upcoming events and family logistics, but no one addressed her directly. She existed in the thread the way furniture exists in a room, present but irrelevant. On January 3rd, Sophia received a certified letter from a law firm she didn't recognize. Inside were divorce papers citing irreconcilable differences and requesting an expedited hearing. The proposed settlement offered $2,000 per month in temporary support until the divorce was finalized, at which point support would terminate entirely. No claim to property, no shared custody arrangement mentioned, as if the baby growing inside her was somehow less real than the assets being divided. She was requested to sign and return the documents within 10 business days. That evening, another letter arrived at the motel, delivered by hand to the front desk. This one came from the Women's Ministry Board at St. Augustine's Church, where Sophia had volunteered for 3 years. She had organized retreats and written curriculum and visited sick members every Tuesday afternoon, sitting with them through chemotherapy sessions and dialysis appointments, bearing witness to pain because everyone deserved to be seen in their suffering. The letter thanked her for her service and explained that the board had decided to restructure its leadership for the coming year. A complete list of new board members was attached. Sophia scanned the names and found Claire Hastings listed as Community Outreach Coordinator. She sat on the motel bed and read both letters again, feeling the baby kick against her ribs in sharp, insistent jabs. Outside, traffic hummed past on the highway, an endless stream of people going somewhere that wasn't here. She thought about calling Maxwell Reed, asking him how much longer, pleading for her father to intervene now rather than waiting until some arbitrary date on a calendar. But she had promised to hold on, and Sophia Beaumont kept her promises even when keeping them hurt. The phone in the motel room rang, a harsh sound that made her jump. She picked up the receiver and heard Margot's voice, tight with something that might have been guilt or fear or both. "Sophia, I need to tell you something." She waited, pressing the phone hard against her ear as if physical pressure could force honesty through the line. Margot's words came fast, tumbling over each other. "Mother has documents. Financial records she says prove you've been stealing from the family accounts. She showed them to Dominic and Garrett last night. They look real, Sophia. Bank transfers, forged signatures, amounts that add up to almost $30,000 over 2 years. I don't believe it. I know you wouldn't, but..." The line went quiet except for Margot's breathing, quick and shallow. "Emma needs her asthma medication. The kind that actually works costs $600 a month, and my insurance only covers half. Mother pays the difference. She's been paying it for 3 years. Last night she told me that if I stayed in contact with you, if I testified in your favor or helped you in any way, she'd stop. She said you made your choices and now I need to make mine." Sophia closed her eyes and felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart, but something adjacent to it. The place where hope lived before it learned better. "It's okay, Margot. Take care of Emma. That's what matters." A sound like a sob, quickly muffled. "I'm so sorry. I should be stronger than this." The line went dead. Sophia set the receiver back in its cradle and stared at the water-stained ceiling, at the cracks in the plaster that looked like rivers on a map to nowhere. The fabricated evidence was good strategy, she had to admit. It gave Vivian plausible deniability, a narrative to explain why Sophia had been removed so completely. Not cruelty, just consequence. Not prejudice, just justice for someone who had betrayed the family's trust. She wondered how many people would believe it. Probably most. It was easier to believe that a woman from nowhere had taken advantage of her position than to believe a family like the Ashcrofts would throw out a pregnant woman for no reason at all. Easier to think she had deserved what happened, that the story made sense only if she had done something to earn her exile. 3 days later, Sophia had her 7-month checkup at a clinic that served women without insurance. She sat in a waiting room with plastic chairs and magazines from 2 years ago, surrounded by other women in various stages of pregnancy, most of them alone or accompanied by tired-looking mothers who held toddlers on their laps. When her name was called, she followed a nurse down a hallway painted institutional beige and lay back on an examination table covered in paper that crinkled every time she moved. The doctor was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and hands that pressed gently on Sophia's belly, feeling for the baby's position. "Everything looks good, strong heartbeat, good size for 30 weeks. Are you getting enough rest?" Sophia almost laughed. "I'm in a motel. The walls are thin and the trucks never stop." The doctor made a note on her chart, her pen moving across the paper with small, precise strokes. "There are programs that can help. Temporary housing assistance, food support, prenatal care subsidies. I can give you some numbers to call." Sophia took the list because refusing would have required explanation. But she folded the paper and put it in her purse, knowing she would never make those calls. 2 more weeks. That was all she needed to survive. 2 more weeks until the 26th, until her father walked into that conference room and showed the Ashcrofts exactly what they had thrown away. But the waiting was its own kind of violence, slow and grinding, the way water erodes stone until the stone forgets it was ever anything but worn smooth. She spent her days in the motel room or walking along the commercial strip near the highway, past fast food restaurants and dollar stores and auto repair shops with hand-painted signs. She ate sparingly, careful with the money she had left, $240 withdrawn from an ATM before the accounts closed. She bought bread and peanut butter and apples, food that didn't require cooking in a room with no kitchen. She drank water from the bathroom tap and told herself it was temporary, that discomfort was just another form of patience. At night, she lay in bed and felt the baby move, strong kicks and rolls that sometimes made her whole belly shift sideways. She talked to her daughter in whispers, told her about Lenora, who would have been an extraordinary grandmother, about the life they would build together once this was over, about the lesson Sophia was learning now that she would pass on someday. That your worth doesn't come from whether people choose to see it, but from the unchanging truth of what you are. Back at the estate, life continued as if Sophia had never existed. Claire moved into the master bedroom 5 days after Christmas, her belongings arriving in neat boxes that Vivian helped her unpack. She organized the closet with ruthless efficiency, removing the few items Sophia had left behind and donating them to charity. She replaced the bedding, bought new curtains in cream silk that cost more than Sophia's motel would for a month, and arranged fresh flowers on the dresser in the space where Sophia's small jewelry box had once sat. Vivian praised her at every opportunity, mentioning to anyone who would listen how refreshing it was to finally have a real partner by Dominic's side, someone who understood what it meant to be part of a family with legacy and standards. She invited Claire to her bridge games and charity luncheons, introduced her as Dominic's fiancée before the divorce was even filed, let alone finalized. The women in Vivian's circle accepted Claire immediately because Claire spoke their language and wore their brands and laughed at their jokes with genuine appreciation. Claire, for her part, was calculating rather than cruel. She didn't hate Sophia. Hate required emotional investment, and Claire invested her emotions only where they generated returns. She saw the Ashcroft family the way she saw every opportunity, as something to be assessed for value and acquired if the numbers made sense. Dominic offered stability and social standing and a surname that opened doors in Boston's legal and business communities. The pregnancy was unfortunate timing but manageable. Once the divorce finalized and enough time had passed, she and Dominic would have their own children, ones that fit the family narrative in a way Sophia's mixed-race daughter never would. She reinforced Vivian's perspective at every turn, agreeing that Sophia had never really belonged, that the marriage had been a mistake from the beginning, that sometimes mercy meant making hard choices for everyone's benefit. She spoke about Sophia with the distant sympathy you might show for someone who had lost their way through their own poor decisions. Regrettable but ultimately predictable. The social erasure spread through concentric circles, each one reinforcing the last until Sophia's isolation felt total. Women she had considered friends stopped returning her calls. People she had volunteered beside for years crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. The few who did speak to her offered empty condolences and vague promises to stay in touch, their eyes already looking past her toward conversations they actually wanted to have. Only one person reached out with anything resembling genuine concern. On January 10th, a letter arrived at the motel addressed in handwriting. Sophia didn't recognize it first. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper, the kind with holes punched on the left side and thin blue lines. 3 sentences, no preamble, no explanation. I should have protected you. I should have spoken up. I'm sorry. Margot's signature at the bottom, small and cramped, as if she had been afraid to take up too much space even on a page no one else would see. Sophia read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in her suitcase, in the inside pocket where she kept her mother's old letters and the ultrasound photos from her first trimester. Forgiveness wasn't fast, but some doors shouldn't be locked permanently. Margot had children to protect and fears Sophia understood even if she couldn't condone the slants they produced. She wondered if she would hear from Dominic, if any part of him retained enough memory of who they had been to feel guilt for what they had become. But he stayed silent, and that silence told her everything she needed to know about how completely Vivian's influence had eroded whatever love he had once felt. Or perhaps the love had never been as deep as Sophia believed, and she had mistaken proximity for connection, habit for devotion, the comfort of being chosen for the reality of being valued. What Sophia didn't know, what no one except Maxwell Reed and Charles Beaumont understood, was that every interaction, every document, every financial transaction was being recorded and cataloged with meticulous precision. For 7 years, Charles had been watching his daughter from a distance that was both painful and necessary. He had seen her fall in love, and he had hoped, genuinely hoped, that Dominic Ashcroft would be worthy of what Sophia offered. For 3 years it looked possible. Dominic had been kind, attentive, genuinely besotted with the woman he had found in a Cambridge cafe. But Charles had also seen the erosion begin, the slow poison of Vivian's disapproval seeping into her son's choices until he stopped choosing Sophia and started choosing the version of himself his mother preferred. Charles had watched through surveillance that was expensive and subtle, through investigators who tracked Dominic's affair and documented every meeting with Claire, through financial analysts who mapped the Ashcroft family's crumbling empire and identified the exact moment when desperation would make them vulnerable. The Ashcroft wealth was smoke, had been for years. The estate was mortgaged 3 times over. Garrett's business ventures had failed consistently, each one hemorrhaging money borrowed against family assets. Vivian's spending was pathological, driven by the need to maintain appearances in a social circle that could detect weakness the way sharks detect blood. They survived on credit and connections and the assumption that old Boston families didn't fail, that the name itself was collateral enough to keep the banks patient. But patience had limits, and the Ashcrofts had reached theirs. They needed $9 million to restructure their debts, to consolidate mortgages and business loans and personal credit lines into something manageable. Without it, foreclosure was 6 months away, maybe less. With it, they could maintain the illusion for another decade, long enough for Dominic to make partner and Garrett to finally launch something successful and Vivienne to die believing her family legacy remained intact. Claire had found the solution, or thought she had. Beaumont Capital Partners was a development firm with extensive holdings in commercial real estate and a reputation for fair dealing. They offered favorable terms, low interest rates, flexible repayment schedules. The paperwork was straightforward, the representatives professional and undemanding. Claire had brokered the deal herself, proud of her competence, secure in the knowledge that she had saved the family she was joining. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Beaumont Capital Partners was wholly owned by a trust established 35 years earlier, by a man who had started with $500 and a willingness to work jobs no one else wanted. Charles Beaumont had cleaned office buildings and hauled construction waste and saved every dollar he didn't absolutely need to survive. He had bought a small commercial property in a neighborhood poised for gentrification, then another, then 5 more. He had invested in a tech startup run by a college friend who needed capital, and when that startup went public, Charles had walked away with $40 million that became 80, then 200, then more than anyone outside his inner circle knew. He had built his empire in silence because silence was safer. He had maintained his daughter's belief that he was gone, because that belief protected her from people who would have treated her differently if they knew. He had given Lenora enough money to retire years before she died, but she had refused it, insisting that Sophia needed to grow up understanding that security came from work and character, not from accounts you didn't earn. They had fought about it, one of their few real arguments, but Charles had ultimately deferred to Lenora's wisdom because she understood their daughter in ways he couldn't. Now, sitting in his office on the 42nd floor of a building he owned but didn't inhabit under his own name, Charles reviewed the surveillance reports from the past month. Photographs of Sophia leaving the motel, her coat pulled tight against January wind, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. Audio recordings of Vivienne's bridge game conversations, casual mentions of that woman and how relieved everyone was that Dominic had finally corrected his mistake. Financial documents showing the Ashcroft family signing papers that transferred ownership of everything they thought they controlled into a structure that answered only to him. Maxwell Reed knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through 15 years of managing Charles's legal affairs with discretion that approached paranoia. He carried a leather portfolio stamped with the Beaumont Capital logo and set it on the desk between them. The closing is confirmed for January 26th at 9 a.m. The Ashcrofts believe they're signing a standard refinancing agreement. They have no idea what the ownership structure actually is. Charles opened the portfolio and scanned the documents inside, thick stacks of contracts and disclosure forms and title transfers. Everything was legal, meticulously so, because Charles had learned long ago that the best revenge was the kind that came with a receipt. And Sophia? Room 212 at the Route 1 Motor Lodge. I had groceries delivered yesterday. She didn't ask questions, just thanked the delivery driver and closed the door. She's holding up, sir, but it's taking a toll. The pregnancy complicates everything. Charles nodded slowly, his jaw tight with the effort of maintaining distance when every instinct screamed at him to go to his daughter, to end this now rather than waiting for a date that still felt impossibly distant. But Lenora's instructions had been explicit. 7 years. Let Sophia live a normal life, find love without the distortion of wealth, discover whether Dominic Ashcroft loved her for who she was or for what she might become. If the love survived, Charles would reveal himself as a blessing on a marriage that deserved support. If it failed, he would reveal himself as protection against people who had proven themselves unworthy. The marriage had failed spectacularly, and now Charles would fulfill the second half of his promise to the woman he had loved more than his own ambition. The woman who had taught him that money without purpose was just numbers on a screen that meant nothing to anyone who mattered. Maxwell cleared his throat, a nervous gesture that meant he was about to say something Charles wouldn't want to hear. "Sir, there's one complication. Vivian has been spreading rumors about embezzlement. She's fabricated financial documents that appear to show Sophia stealing from family accounts. It's crude work, wouldn't hold up to forensic accounting, but it's effective for reputation damage." Charles felt his hands curl into fists on the desk, his knuckles going white with the pressure. "Do we have the originals?" "In our possession since December 27th. Vivian sent them to Dominic via email. Our people intercepted them in real time. We have everything, including the metadata showing when and where the documents were created. If she tries to press charges, we'll destroy her credibility in about 30 seconds. "Good. Make sure Sophia knows we have them. I don't want her afraid of legal action." Maxwell made a note on his tablet, his stylus moving in quick, efficient strokes. "There's one more thing. Margot Ashcroft sent Sophia a letter apologizing. It arrived 3 days ago. I thought you should know." Charles leaned back in his chair and studied the ceiling, the recessed lighting that cost more than most people's cars, but provided no answers to questions that didn't have quantifiable solutions. Margot was young, afraid, trapped between loyalty and survival. He understood that kind of fear. He had lived it himself decades ago when choosing between pride and pragmatism meant the difference between eating and going hungry. He couldn't blame her for choosing her daughter over someone else's fight. Leave Margot alone. She did what mothers do. When this is over, if Sophia wants to reconcile, that's her decision. Maxwell nodded and stood, gathering his portfolio. At the door, he paused and looked back. "Sir, for what it's worth, your daughter is stronger than anyone realizes. Stronger than Dominic, certainly. Probably stronger than you." Charles smiled, brief and genuine. "She gets that from her mother." After Maxwell left, Charles pulled up the live security feed from the motel. The camera was positioned across the street, angled to capture room 212's door and window. He watched the screen for 5 minutes, saw nothing but empty parking lot and the occasional guest moving between rooms. Then the door opened and Sophia emerged, bundled in a coat that was too thin for the weather, her belly prominent even under the layers. She walked to her car, spent 2 minutes scraping ice from the windshield, then drove away toward the commercial strip where there was a library that stayed open late. He knew because he had people following her. Not constantly, but enough to ensure she was safe, that if she needed help, someone would be close enough to provide it. She didn't know about the surveillance, and he wouldn't tell her unless absolutely necessary. Some protection worked best when it remained invisible. Charles closed the feed and returned to the documents Maxwell had left, reviewing the closing procedures for the 4th time because perfection required repetition. Everything needed to land exactly right. The timing, the revelation, the systematic dismantling of every assumption the Ashcrofts had made about who held power in this situation. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about justice, the kind that came with compound interest after 7 years of watching his daughter try to belong somewhere. She was never truly welcome. The morning of January 20th, Sophia woke to find an envelope under her motel room door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a phone number and a message in Maxwell's precise handwriting. "Call me before noon. Your father wants to confirm you're ready." She sat on the bed and dialed, her phone now restored through a prepaid plan she had purchased with the last of her cash. Maxwell answered on the first ring. "Ms. Beaumont, how are you feeling?" "Like I've been holding my breath for a month and I'm about to pass out." A pause, then a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Understandable. Your father asked me to confirm that you want to proceed with the closing as planned. If you'd rather we postpone, if you need more time to recover or prepare, he'll wait. Sophia looked around the motel room, at the thin curtains and the water stains and the carpet worn down to threads in places. She thought about Vivian's smile when she lifted the plate from the table, about Claire's perfect composure as she accepted a ring that didn't belong to her, about Dominic's voice explaining that they were moving in different directions as if 6 years of marriage were just a minor miscalculation that needed correcting. I'm ready. I've been ready since Christmas. Tell him not to wait. Understood. The closing is January 26th at 9 a.m., Berkshire Conference Center downtown. You'll meet your father in the lobby at 8:45. Dress professionally. This is a business meeting, not a confrontation. She almost laughed. Maxwell, everything about this is a confrontation. True, but we're going to conduct it with absolute professionalism. That's what makes it devastating. He gave her the address and hung up. Sophia set down the phone and felt the baby kick. 3 sharp jabs against her ribs that made her wince and smile simultaneously. 6 more days, 144 hours. She could survive that. She had survived everything else. That afternoon, she used $20 she couldn't spare to buy a charcoal maternity suit from a thrift store near the highway. It was slightly too large in the shoulders but fit well enough everywhere else. Professional without being expensive. The kind of outfit that suggested competence without demanding attention. She hung it carefully in the motel closet and stared at it for a long time, imagining the moment when she would walk into that conference room and watch realization dawn on faces that had forgotten she existed. The days crawled past with excruciating slowness, each one identical to the last. Sophia walked to the library and read books she couldn't concentrate on. She ate peanut butter sandwiches and apples, food that tasted like nothing but filled the empty spaces. She talked to her daughter at night, whispering promises into the darkness, telling her that everything happening now was temporary, that the world would be different on the other side of January 26th. On the 24th, she received a text from Dominic's lawyer requesting she sign the divorce papers immediately. The message was professional and cold, noting that her delay was causing complications with property settlements and financial planning. She deleted it without responding, knowing the complications were about to multiply in ways Todd Brennan couldn't imagine. On the 25th, the night before the closing, Sophia lay awake until 3 in the morning, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her. She wondered if her daughter could sense her anxiety, if stress crossed the placental barrier and manifested as insomnia for both of them. She whispered apologies to her belly, promised that tomorrow everything would change, that they would be safe and secure and no one would ever throw them out into the cold again. At dawn, she rose and showered in water that never quite got hot enough, then dressed slowly in the thrift store suit and the gold locket her mother had given her when she graduated high school. She braided her hair and pinned it up, applied minimal makeup because her hands were shaking too badly to do anything complicated. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, 7 months pregnant and exhausted and terrified, but also certain, finally, that the waiting was over. She drove downtown through morning traffic, her hands tight on the steering wheel, her thoughts spiraling through every possible outcome. What if her father didn't show? What if the Ashcrofts somehow figured it out before the papers were signed? What if Vivian found a way to turn this against her, to make Sophia the villain in a story where she had been nothing but faithful? But when she pulled into the parking garage beneath the Berkshire Conference Center and rode the elevator to the lobby, Charles Beaumont was waiting exactly where Maxwell said he would be. He stood near the windows overlooking the street, a man in his early 70s wearing a suit that probably cost more than the motel had for the entire month, his posture straight and his expression calm with the kind of certainty that came from knowing exactly what would happen in the next hour. He turned when the elevator doors opened and his face transformed, professional composure giving way to something raw and aching. He crossed the lobby in long strides and wrapped his arms around Sophia carefully, mindful of her belly, his chin resting on top of her head. "I've missed you so much, baby girl." Sophia pressed her face against his shoulder and felt 7 years of careful distance collapse into this single moment. "I thought you were dead, Daddy. For 7 years I thought you were dead." "I know. Your mother and I agreed it was the only way to know if Dominic loved you for who you are, not for what we could give you. I'm so sorry it took this long. I'm so sorry you had to wait." She pulled back and looked up at him, seeing her own eyes reflected in his face, the same warm brown, the same determination. Was it worth it? The waiting? Charles's expression hardened, his jaw setting with resolve that looked like stone. "Yes, because now we know exactly who they are, and they're about to learn exactly who you've always been." He offered his arm and Sophia took it, feeling strength return to her legs, certainty replacing the fear that had lived in her chest for the past month. They walked together to the elevator, rode up to the 14th floor, and stepped out into a hallway lined with conference rooms. Maxwell Reed was waiting outside room 1404, checking his watch, his face breaking into a rare smile when he saw them. "Perfect timing. They've been here for 10 minutes. Vivian keeps asking why the Beaumont representatives are late." Charles's smile was cold and satisfied. "Let's not keep them waiting any longer." Maxwell opened the door and stepped aside. Charles entered first, his presence commanding immediate attention. Then Sophia, moving slowly because of her belly, feeling every eye in the room land on her with the force of physical impact. Vivian sat at the far end of the conference table, her face frozen in an expression that cycled rapidly through confusion and shock and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Dominic was beside her, his mouth opening as if to speak but no words emerging. Garrett stared without blinking, his face draining of color. And Claire, positioned where she probably thought she belonged, went very still, her eyes calculating, already trying to determine what this meant and how she could turn it to her advantage. Charles walked to the head of the table and pulled out a chair for Sophia. She sat carefully, settled her hands on the tabletop, and met Vivian's eyes with a calm that felt like armor. Maxwell took the seat beside her and opened his leather portfolio, extracting documents that would rewrite everything the Ashcrofts believed about their own lives. The conference room smelled like expensive wood polish and filtered air. Outside the windows, Boston stretched in every direction. A city that looked beautiful from this height, clean and ordered and full of promise that existed mostly for people born, knowing which doors to knock on. Maxwell cleared his throat and began reading in a voice that gave away nothing, professional and measured, the tone of someone announcing changes to a flight schedule rather than the systematic destruction of a family's entire foundation. And Sophia sat very still, her daughter kicking inside her, and watched the color continue draining from Vivian Ashcroft's face as the truth began finally to arrive. Maxwell Reed's voice filled the conference room with the steady precision of someone reading a weather report, each word landing with neutral clarity that made the content more devastating rather than less. He held the first document at an angle that caught the overhead lighting, the Beaumont Capital Partners letterhead clearly visible to everyone seated around the polished mahogany table. Beaumont Capital Partners is a wholly owned subsidiary of Beaumont Holdings Incorporated. Beaumont Holdings was established in 1988 with an initial capitalization of $500. Current asset valuation as of December 31st stands at $12.4 billion, with primary holdings in commercial real estate development, technology venture capital, and strategic property acquisitions throughout the Northeastern Corridor. Vivian's hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white against the dark wood. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again without producing sound. It was the first time Sophia had ever seen the woman unable to speak. unable to summon the careful phrases that usually flowed so effortlessly. Maxwell continued without pause, turning to the second page. The chief executive officer and majority shareholder of Beaumont Holdings is Charles Beaumont, seated to my left. Ms. Sophia Beaumont, seated beside me, serves as chief operating officer and sole heir to the complete holdings upon Mr. Beaumont's death or incapacitation. Dominic's face had gone from pale to gray, the color of concrete in winter. He stared at Sophia as if seeing her for the first time, his eyes moving from her face to her belly to the gold locket at her throat, that cheap piece of jewelry he had once suggested she replace with something more appropriate for family gatherings. His lips formed words that didn't quite emerge. That's impossible. Charles leaned back in his chair with the casual authority of someone who had spent decades in rooms exactly like this one, making decisions that shaped cities. Your mother told Sophia I was dead. It was necessary. We needed to know whether you would love my daughter for who she is or whether you would treat her differently if you knew what she would inherit. You failed that test spectacularly, Mr. Ashcroft. The words landed like a physical blow. Dominic's hand moved to his chest as if checking for a wound, his breathing suddenly visible in the way his shoulders rose and fell. Maxwell turned to the third document, this one bearing the seal of the Massachusetts Registry of Deeds. The property commonly known as the Ashcroft Estate, located at 427 Beacon Hill Drive, is held in trust by Beaumont Real Estate Holdings as of November 18th. The deed transfer was completed as part of the refinancing package negotiated by Ms. Claire Hastings on behalf of the Ashcroft family. Claire's expression hadn't changed, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle leaning away from Dominic as if creating distance from the blast radius. Her eyes moved to the exit, then back to the documents, then to Charles, calculating her next move with the speed of someone who had survived by knowing when to cut losses. Garrett spoke for the first time, his voice rough and strained. What do you mean, held in trust? We own that house. My grandfather built it in 1943. Maxwell didn't look up from his reading. Your grandfather built it with a mortgage from Beacon Hill Savings and Trust, which was acquired by Beaumont Financial in 2011. When the original mortgage came due for refinancing in 2015, Beaumont Financial offered terms your father accepted without question. The subsequent refinancings in 2018 and 2021 were handled through subsidiary companies. But the ultimate ownership has belonged to the Beaumont Family Trust for 9 years. The silence that followed felt dense enough to have weight, pressing down on everyone in the room except Charles and Maxwell, who sat with the calm of people who knew exactly what was coming next. Vivian found her voice thin and brittle. This is fraud. You can't just... We have lawyers, we have connections, you can't come in here and... Charles held up one hand, a gesture so controlled it stopped Vivian mid-sentence. Mrs. Ashcroft, every transaction we've conducted with your family has been completely legal and properly documented. Every deed transfer, every mortgage agreement, every financial arrangement has been reviewed by attorneys and filed with the appropriate government agencies. If you'd like to contest any of this in court, I encourage you to do so. We have excellent documentation. Maxwell produced another document, this one thicker, bound with a black cover. The employment contract between Dominic Ashcroft and Whitmore Sterling and Associates was brokered through Beaumont Corporate Services in 2019. Whitmore. Sterling is a subsidiary of Beaumont Professional Holdings. Mr. Ashcroft's position, salary, and bonuses have been facilitated by Beaumont companies for the past 4 years. Dominic's face went from gray to green, a sickly color that suggested nausea. His voice came out as barely more than a whisper. My promotions, the cases they gave me, all real, Charles said, his tone almost gentle. You're a competent attorney, Mr. Ashcroft, but competence gets you through the door. What gets you the corner office and the partnership track is someone making calls on your behalf to people who owe them favors. I made those calls. I cleared the path for your career because I thought my daughter loved you, and I wanted her to be happy." The past tense of that sentence hung in the air like smoke. Sophia felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, 3 sharp jabs that made her breath catch. She pressed her hand to her belly and felt her daughter settle, as if even in the womb she could sense that this moment mattered, that what was happening in this room would determine the shape of her entire life. Maxwell continued through the documents, each one revealing another layer of the structure Charles had built around the Ashcroft family, without their knowledge or awareness. The luxury sedan Garrett drove, a gift from Vivian 3 years ago, had been purchased through a Beaumont subsidiary and registered to a company that answered to Charles. The board position Vivian held at the Museum of Fine Arts, secured through a donation she had made in the family name, had been funded by a grant from the Beaumont Foundation. The private school tuition for Margot's daughter Emma, the payments Vivian made each month to ensure her granddaughter received the best education, came from an account Charles had established specifically for that purpose. Every piece of the life they thought they had built through their own effort and connections had been constructed at least in part by the man they had dismissed as dead, the father of the woman they had thrown barefoot into December snow. Garrett's voice cracked as he processed the implications. How many things do you control?" Maxwell flipped to a summary page near the back of the document. 73% of the Ashcroft family's current assets, income streams, and financial stability can be traced back to Beaumont companies or partnerships. The remaining 27% represents inherited wealth from previous generations, though much of that has been used as collateral for loans that are also held by Beaumont Financial. Sophia watched Vivian's face cycle through emotions too quickly to name, settling finally on a kind of desperate fury that made her eyes bright and her jaw rigid. The older woman turned to Sophia with an expression that might have been hatred or might have been fear or might have been the dawning realization that she had destroyed her family's future with her own hands. "Who are you?" The question came out hoarse, stripped of the careful diction Vivian usually maintained. Charles answered before Sophia could speak. "She's my daughter. She's a woman who spent 7 years trying to belong in your family, who cooked your meals and organized your events and smiled while you called her names you thought she didn't understand. She's the mother of your grandchild, the one you threw away like she was nothing, and now she's the person who owns the foundation you're all standing on." Vivian's hands shook as she reached for her water glass, missed, knocked it over. The water spread across the polished table, soaking into documents, dripping onto the floor. No one moved to clean it up. Dominic finally looked directly at Sophia, meeting her eyes for the first time since she had entered the room. "You let me think. All these years, you never said—" The words died in his throat as Sophia shook her head slowly. "I didn't know, Dominic. My father told me he was building something, but he never said what or how much. He asked me to live normally, to see if the man I loved would stay when things got hard. You didn't stay. You didn't even hesitate. My mother said, she told me you were wrong for us, that you didn't belong, that—" "I know what she said. I was there for all of it. I heard every carefully worded suggestion, every concern about my background, every comment about how simple I was. I stayed quiet because I loved you and I thought love was enough. It wasn't." The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sophia winced. Charles noticed immediately, his hand moving toward her in protective instinct before stopping himself. Maxwell poured water from a fresh bottle into a clean glass and slid it across to Sophia without interrupting his presentation. He moved to the final section of documents, the terms that would govern the Ashcroft family's future. His voice remained steady, professional, giving no indication whether he thought these terms were harsh or merciful. "The refinancing package you signed in November includes specific conditions. The mortgage on the estate will be held by Beaumont Real Estate Holdings for 30 years, with monthly payments of $52,000 beginning February 1st. These payments are non-negotiable and must be made in full by the first of each month or default provisions take effect immediately. Vivian's voice came out strangled. 52,000? We can't possibly. You've been spending approximately 68,000 per month on discretionary expenses for the past 2 years, Maxwell said, producing a spreadsheet. Country club memberships, luxury retail purchases, spa appointments, catering for social events. If you adjust your lifestyle to match your actual income rather than borrowed money, the payments are manageable. Garrett leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his head in his hands. This is insane. You're destroying us. Charles's expression didn't soften. I'm giving you exactly what you gave my daughter. A chance to survive if you're willing to work for it. She was pregnant and barefoot in the snow on Christmas Eve because your mother decided she didn't belong. Now your mother will spend the next 30 years making monthly payments to the woman she threw away. And every single one of those payments will be a reminder of what happens when you treat people like they're disposable. Sophia felt something shift inside her chest, not the baby but something in her own heart, a release of pressure she had been holding for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. She leaned forward slightly, her hands flat on the table, and spoke directly to Vivian for the second time in her life. Mrs. Ashcroft, I told you on Christmas Eve that you should have waited. You didn't listen. For 7 years I lived in your world trying to earn acceptance I was never going to receive. I cooked your meals and smiled at your insults and pretended I didn't notice when you seated me with the children at Thanksgiving because you couldn't bear to acknowledge me as family. You took my ring in front of 60 people and you didn't let me get my shoes. You locked the door and turned up the music so you wouldn't have to hear me leave. Her voice remained calm, each word measured and clear. My father wanted to destroy you that night. He called me while I was standing in the snow and asked permission to end this immediately. I told him to wait, not because I love you or because I think you deserve mercy, but because my daughter deserves to grow up knowing her mother chose grace over vengeance. Vivian's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks, her careful makeup running in dark streaks. Please, you have to understand. I was protecting my family. I thought you were wrong for them. I know. You made that very clear. Sophia's hand moved to her belly, protective and certain. But you were protecting an illusion, Mrs. Ashcroft. Your family was already broken. The money was gone. The legacy was borrowed. The whole structure was about to collapse. You threw me out to make room for Claire, thinking she could save you. What you didn't know is that the company offering to save you belonged to the woman you discarded. She turned to Dominic, who sat frozen in his chair, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. You get to keep your job for now. 90 days probation. If you perform adequately, you'll be evaluated for permanent retention. If not, we'll assist with placement elsewhere. Your salary remains the same, but bonuses and partnership considerations are suspended indefinitely. His head snapped up, hope and desperation mixing in his expression. Sophia, if we could just talk, if I could explain. There's nothing to explain. You made your choices. You stopped defending me to your mother. You started an affair while I was pregnant with your child. You sat beside me at Christmas dinner and never once looked at my face while you announced you were leaving. Those weren't mistakes, Dominic. Those were decisions you made consciously, repeatedly, over months and years. The silence that followed her words felt absolute. Outside the conference room windows, the city moved through its ordinary rhythms, people going to work and buying coffee and living lives that didn't require them to sit in rooms like this one, watching their entire understanding of reality dismantle itself piece by piece. Claire stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. All eyes turned to her, and she met them with the composure of someone who had already calculated her exit strategy. I assume my services are no longer required by the Ashcroft family. Maxwell didn't look up from his documents. That would be correct, Ms. Hastings. She gathered her purse and coat with efficient movements, her face revealing nothing. At the door, she paused and looked back at Dominic. "I'm sorry it worked out this way. You're a good attorney. I hope you land on your feet." Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the shocked silence. Dominic stared at the space where she had been, his mouth slightly open, apparently only now realizing that Claire's affection had been as conditional as the wealth he thought he possessed. Garrett broke the silence with a sound between a laugh and a sob. "She lasted, what, 30 seconds? The second she realized the money wasn't real, she walked." 28 days, Maxwell corrected, consulting his notes. "Ms. Hastings will vacate the master bedroom at the estate by February 23rd. After that date, any belongings she leaves behind will be considered abandoned property." Charles stood, signaling that the business portion of this meeting had concluded. "The divorce proceedings will continue as scheduled. Sophia has agreed not to contest the expedited timeline. However, the settlement terms originally proposed are void. New terms will be submitted by our attorneys within the week. They will include full custody of the child support payments calculated on Mr. Ashcroft's actual salary and a structured visitation schedule that prioritizes the child's well-being over parental convenience." Dominic's voice came out strangled. "You're taking my daughter?" "I'm protecting my daughter," Sophia corrected. "You'll have visitation rights, supervised initially, then unsupervised if you demonstrate reliability and appropriate judgment." "I'm not interested in keeping her from you, Dominic. I'm interested in making sure she grows up knowing that love isn't something you withdraw when it becomes inconvenient." She rose from her chair carefully, one hand on the table for balance, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. Charles moved to help her, but she shook her head slightly, managing on her own. She walked to where Vivian sat collapsed in her chair, tears still streaming, and stopped close enough that the older woman had to look up to meet her eyes. "You should have waited, Mrs. Ashcroft. If you had shown me even a fraction of the patience I showed your family, we wouldn't be here right now. But you were so certain I was beneath you, so convinced that I brought nothing to your family except the burden of having to tolerate me, that you never once asked yourself what you might be wrong about." Vivian's voice came out as a whisper. "I didn't know. How could I have known?" "You couldn't. That's exactly the point. You treated me like I was worthless without knowing anything about me except my skin color and my background. You decided who I was before I ever walked through your door, and nothing I did in 7 years changed your mind. That's not my failure, Mrs. Ashcroft. That's yours." Sophia turned and walked toward the exit where her father waited. At the threshold, she looked back one more time at the 3 people sitting in various states of collapse around the conference table. "The mortgage payment is due on the 1st of every month. The account information is in the documents Maxwell gave you. I suggest you read them carefully and mark your calendars. I don't offer extensions or grace periods." Then she stepped into the hallway, and Charles closed the door behind them with the same soft finality as the estate's front door on Christmas Eve. Except this time, Sophia was the one walking away with certainty rather than the one being cast out into cold she hadn't prepared for. The consequences rippled outward from that conference room in expanding circles, each one touching lives that had never been part of the original conflict but were caught nonetheless in the wake. Within 24 hours, word had spread through the social networks that sustained families like the Ashcrofts, not through official announcements or press releases, but through the whispered conversations that happened in country club locker rooms and charity committee meetings. The careful questions asked over martini lunches that extracted information without appearing to pry. The story grew with each retelling, details shifting and expanding until the basic facts became almost mythological. Vivian Ashcroft had thrown out her pregnant daughter-in-law on Christmas Eve, only to discover that the woman she dismissed owned everything the family thought they had built. Some versions added elements that weren't true: billion-dollar lawsuits and federal investigations and dramatic arrests. Other versions stripped away context until it became a simple morality tale about the dangers of judging people by appearances. But the truth, properly documented and legally airtight, was devastating enough without embellishment. The Ashcroft family's entire existence depended on the continued goodwill of the woman they had treated as disposable, and everyone who mattered knew it. Vivian's invitations dried up with shocking speed. The charity boards that had welcomed her presence for decades suddenly found their rosters full. The country club where she had held membership for 30 years developed unexpected concerns about her account status and payment history. Women who had smiled at her across dinner tables for years discovered they were too busy to return her calls, their social calendars mysteriously packed with conflicts that prevented lunch dates or coffee meetings. The erasure was complete and surgical, executed with the same careful courtesy Vivian herself had perfected over decades of maintaining social hierarchies. No one was explicitly cruel. No one made dramatic pronouncements or public scenes. They simply stopped including her, stopped seeking her opinion, stopped acting as if her presence added value to their gatherings. She found herself attending a different church by mid-February, unable to bear the way temperature dropped when she entered St. Augustine's on Sunday mornings. People smiled and shook her hand and asked polite questions about her week, but the warmth that had once characterized those exchanges had evaporated. She was tolerated, which was somehow worse than being actively disliked. Tolerance suggested you weren't worth the energy required for actual hatred. Garrett discovered that business opportunities he had been counting on had vanished as well. Investors who had promised to review his proposals stopped returning emails. Partnerships that had seemed certain fell through without explanation. His attempts to leverage the Ashcroft name, the connections he had spent his life cultivating, produced nothing but awkward silences and vague promises to stay in touch. By March 1st, he had accepted a position in the warehouse division of Beaumont Holdings, starting at $16 per hour with basic benefits. The work was physical and exhausting, loading trucks and managing inventory, nothing like the executive roles he had imagined for himself. But it was employment, and employment meant he could contribute to the mortgage payment that came due with relentless consistency every month. Dominic kept his position at Whitmore, Sterling, but the trajectory that had seemed inevitable 6 months earlier had disappeared completely. He was reassigned from high-profile corporate cases to document review, the legal equivalent of clerical work, necessary but unglamorous. His colleagues treated him with careful professionalism that stopped just short of friendship. He wasn't fired, but he was effectively neutered, his career reduced to competent mediocrity. He moved out of the master bedroom at the estate without being asked, taking one of the smaller guest rooms on the second floor. Claire's belongings vanished on February 22nd, removed while he was at work. She left no note, no forwarding address, just empty drawers and bare hangers and the faint scent of her perfume that lingered for a few days before fading entirely. The parallels weren't lost on him the way history had recycled itself. The same closet, the same emptiness, a different woman who had decided he wasn't worth staying for once the circumstances changed. He lay awake at night in the small bed and thought about the notes he used to leave in Sophia's jacket pockets. The Sunday mornings reading newspapers, the version of himself who had seemed capable of genuine affection before his mother's whispers convinced him that comfort was more important than character. In late February, almost exactly 1 month after the conference room revelation, a letter arrived at the motel where Sophia no longer lived. The front desk forwarded it to the address Maxwell had provided, a brownstone in Brooklyn that Sophia had purchased with money that was entirely her own, earned through work she had done for Beaumont Holdings over the past 7 years that no one except her father had known about. The envelope was simple, white paper with no return address, and inside was a single sheet in Margot's handwriting. 3 sentences, no preamble, no justification. Just the stark honesty of someone who had failed a test she didn't know she was taking. I should have protected you. I should have spoken up. I'm sorry. Sophia read it twice while sitting at the kitchen table of her new home, sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked a small garden where spring was just beginning to show itself in green shoots pushing through winter-dead soil. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the wooden box where she kept her mother's final letter and the ultrasound photos from her first trimester and the note her father had given her on Christmas Eve. She picked up her phone and sent a text, brief and neutral. Coffee next week? I have something to show you. The response came within minutes. Yes, please. I'll bring Emma. Forgiveness wasn't fast and it didn't erase what had happened, but some doors shouldn't remain locked forever. Margot had made a choice under duress, protecting her daughter the way mothers do when all their options carry costs too high to bear. Sophia understood that kind of impossible decision now in ways she hadn't when the letter first arrived. Understood it in her bones and in her belly where her own daughter moved and kicked and reminded her every moment that maternal love made cowards of even the bravest people. April arrived with sudden warmth that felt like blessing after the brutal cold of winter. The trees outside Sophia's windows filled with tiny green leaves that uncurled in the sun. The garden below produced crocuses and daffodils, bright spots of color that seemed impossibly optimistic after months of gray. And on April 7th, 3 weeks before her due date, Sophia woke at 3 in the morning with contractions that felt like her entire abdomen was trying to turn itself inside out. Charles drove her to the hospital through empty pre-dawn streets, his hands steady on the wheel despite the fear Sophia could see in the tight line of his jaw. He had missed her childhood, missed her graduation and her wedding and 7 years of her life because they had agreed that distance was necessary. He wasn't going to miss the birth of his granddaughter. Labor lasted 14 hours, brutal and exhausting in the way that reminded women their bodies were capable of things that seemed impossible until they had no choice but to accomplish them. Sophia gripped her father's hand hard enough to leave marks, breathing through contractions that peaked and subsided and peaked again like waves attempting to drown her. The nurses were kind and efficient, bringing ice chips and warm blankets and words of encouragement that Sophia barely heard over the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. At 5:47 in the evening, Hope Grace Beaumont entered the world screaming, her face scrunched and red, her tiny fists waving in fury at the cold air and the bright lights and the hands that cleaned fluid from her mouth and nose. The nurse placed her on Sophia's chest, skin to skin, and the screaming stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. Sophia looked down at her daughter, at the perfect curve of her cheek and the dark hair plastered wet against her skull, and felt something crack open inside her chest that had been sealed closed for longer than she could remember. This child would never be thrown out into snow. This child would never be told she didn't belong. This child would grow up knowing exactly what she was worth. Because Sophia would tell her every single day until the words became bone-deep certainty, rather than hopeful affirmation. Charles stood beside the hospital bed with tears streaming down his face, his hand hovering near Hope's head as if afraid to touch something so impossibly small and fragile. She's perfect, baby girl. She's absolutely perfect. Sophia looked up at her father and smiled through her own tears. She gets that from her grandmother. The nurse returned to take Hope for measurements and tests, promising to bring her back soon. Sophia lay back against the pillows and closed her eyes, exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. She felt hollowed out and filled up simultaneously, emptied of everything except this single overwhelming certainty that she would destroy anyone who tried to hurt the tiny human who had just screamed her way into existence. Dominic was granted his first supervised visitation when Hope was 2 weeks old. He arrived at the brownstone at exactly 10 in the morning as scheduled, wearing a suit as if this were a business meeting rather than time with his daughter. The social worker who facilitated the visit sat in the corner with a notebook, observing without interfering, her presence a reminder that trust had to be earned incrementally. He held Hope awkwardly, his hands uncertain of where to place themselves on her small body. She stared up at him with dark eyes that hadn't yet decided what color they would be, solemn and assessing in the way newborns sometimes looked at the world. He whispered things Sophia couldn't hear, his voice too low to carry, his face doing complicated things as he processed the reality of holding a daughter he hadn't been present to meet. After 30 minutes, Hope started fussing, her small face scrunching in preparation for serious crying. Dominic tried rocking her, tried adjusting how he held her, but the fussing escalated into full distress. Sophia took her back and Hope quieted immediately, recognizing the heartbeat she had listened to for 9 months, the voice that had whispered promises through motel walls and hospital nights. Dominic's face did something complicated as he watched them, a kind of grief that looked like understanding arriving too late to matter. She knows you. She doesn't know me at all. She will, if you show up consistently, if you do the work. Yeah. Sophia kept her voice neutral, stating facts rather than making accusations. Children don't owe us anything, Dominic. We owe them everything. Showing up is the bare minimum. He left after an hour, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him look smaller than Sophia remembered. The social worker made notes in her book and promised to schedule the next visit for 2 weeks later. Same time, same conditions. Margot came the following afternoon, bringing Emma, who was 6 years old, with her mother's dark curly hair and her own shy smile. She held a carefully wrapped package that turned out to be a wooden mobile, hand-carved animals that spun slowly in the air above Hope's bassinet. The craftsmanship was remarkable, each animal detailed and smooth, clearly made by someone who understood that gifts were more meaningful when they required effort rather than just expense. Margot stood in the doorway of the nursery and cried quietly while Emma knelt beside the bassinet, whispering to Hope in the serious tone children use when they think adults aren't listening. "You're very lucky. Your mama loves you so much she fought a whole family to keep you safe." Sophia felt her throat tighten, her own eyes burning. She put her hand on Margot's shoulder and squeezed gently. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for letting me. I don't deserve." "We don't talk about deserving. We talk about what we do next. You're here now. That matters." They had coffee in the kitchen while Emma entertained Hope with soft songs and gentle touches, already comfortable with her new cousin in the way children adapted to changes adults found impossible. Margot explained that she had started paying her own portion of Emma's medication, cutting back on other expenses to make it work. She had told Vivian that she wouldn't accept money that came with conditions attached to her conscience. The conversation was careful at first, both women navigating around the weight of everything unsaid, but slowly, tentatively, they found their way back to something that resembled the friendship they had started building before fear and family loyalty tore it apart. Not the same friendship, but something new that acknowledged the past without being trapped by it. By May, the Ashcroft estate had taken on the shabby quality of a place maintained by people who couldn't afford the level of upkeep required. The lawn service was canceled, replaced by Garrett pushing a mower on weekends. The cleaning staff was reduced from 3 days a week to 1. Vivian learned to cook, badly, producing meals that were edible but joyless compared to the elaborate spreads she had once taken for granted when Sophia prepared them. The first mortgage payment had been made on time, scraped together from Dominic's salary and Garrett's warehouse wages in the systematic liquidation of assets that weren't essential. The second payment came harder, requiring Vivian to sell jewelry she had inherited from her mother. The third payment loomed on the horizon like a storm they could see coming but couldn't avoid. Dominic drove past his old studio apartment one Sunday in late May, the place where he and Sophia had been genuinely happy before his mother's influence corroded everything worth keeping. The building looked exactly as he remembered, red brick worn smooth by decades of New England weather. He parked across the street and stared at the second-floor window where they used to leave the blinds open so morning light would wake them together. Different curtains hung there now, pale blue instead of the cream fabric Sophia had chosen from a discount store because it was all they could afford. Different people living a different life, occupying space he had abandoned because it wasn't impressive enough for the future his mother insisted he deserved. He thought about the notes he used to write on scraps of paper, thinking about you, and you make everything make sense, phrases that had felt profound when he meant them and hollow now that he understood what he had traded them for. Sophia had kept every single one, he learned later through discovery during the divorce proceedings. She had a wooden box containing 6 years of his handwriting, evidence that he had once been capable of small kindnesses he no longer recognized in himself. Some men lose a woman and learn from what they destroyed. Some men lose a woman and just lose, the lesson sliding past them like water over stone that refuses to absorb anything except its own slow erosion. Dominic sat in his car watching the window where his best self had lived and died, and he couldn't tell which kind of man he was becoming. Sophia built her new life with the same quiet determination she had applied to surviving the old one. She restructured Beaumont Holdings' charitable arm, focusing resources on programs that addressed systemic barriers rather than surface symptoms. Scholarships for Black women in STEM fields, affordable housing in the Boston neighborhoods where she had grown up, maternal health clinics offering free prenatal care to women who couldn't afford the kind of medical attention that had kept hope safe through complicated pregnancy. She didn't do press interviews or attend gala fundraisers where donors could congratulate themselves for their generosity. The work happened quietly, announced through program launches and facility openings rather than personal publicity. People who needed help found it without having to know whose money made it possible. The buildings rose and the scholarships landed in mailboxes and the clinics opened their doors, and Sophia's name appeared only in legal documents that most people never read. Charles visited every Sunday, arriving with groceries and patience, and the kind of presents that made Hope giggle and reach for him with chubby hands that were just learning to grasp intentionally. He read to his granddaughter from books about strong women and quiet revolutions, his voice gentle as he turned pages and pointed at pictures. One Sunday afternoon in June, he and Sophia sat on the small patio behind the brownstone while Hope napped upstairs, baby monitor crackling occasionally with the sound of her breathing. The garden had filled in completely, roses blooming against the back fence, herbs growing in terracotta pots that lined the stone path. "Your mother would be so proud of you, baby girl, the way you handled everything, the grace you showed when you had every right to be vengeful. That takes a strength most people never develop." Sophia plucked a sprig of mint from the nearest pot and crushed it between her fingers, releasing the sharp scent into the warm air. "I didn't do it for them, Daddy. I did it for Hope. I don't want her growing up thinking that power means crushing people who hurt you. I want her to understand that real power is knowing you could destroy someone and choosing not to because you're building something better than revenge." Charles reached over and took her hand, his grip firm and certain. "She'll understand, because you'll teach her the same way your mother taught you. Not with grand speeches, but with every single choice you make when things get hard." The monitor crackled with Hope's waking sounds, small grunts that would escalate to crying if someone didn't respond quickly. Sophia stood and stretched, feeling the lingering ache in her back from carrying and delivering a 8-pound baby. "That's my cue. Want to help with her bath? I'd be honored." They went inside together, father and daughter moving through the rhythms of caring for the newest generation, teaching Hope through touch and tone that she was loved unconditionally, that her worth was absolute regardless of what anyone else believed, that she came from a line of people who understood patience as the most expensive currency anyone could own. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary chaos, millions of people living lives that intersected and diverged in patterns too complex to map. Somewhere in that maze, Vivian Ashcroft wrote a check for $52,000 and sealed it in an envelope addressed to Beaumont Real Estate Holdings. Somewhere else, Dominic sat in a small bedroom and wondered if his daughter would ever look at him the way she looked at her mother, with absolute trust that came from never being abandoned. And somewhere in Brooklyn, in a brownstone with a garden that bloomed improbably, a baby girl learned to smile, unaware that her existence had rewritten the entire world around her. The consequences would continue for 30 years, monthly reminders of choices that couldn't be unmade. But consequences weren't punishment. They were just the price of learning what happens when you treat people like they're worthless, without ever asking yourself what you might be wrong about. Sophia Beaumont had waited 7 years to be seen. Now everyone was looking, and what they saw was exactly what her mother had promised she would become. A woman whose worth had nothing to do with their acceptance and everything to do with the unchanging truth of what she was.